Okay, so this is lecture 3 of part 2 of the life and thought of Moses Maimonides. And today we're going to continue looking at the laws of prayer. So we're looking at the extra material. We want to go to that first from last week, page 3. If anybody doesn't have any, I still have a couple of copies. But last week's material, we're going to look at chapter 8. We had looked at the things that sort of, prevented somebody from properly concentrating on prayer, which Maimonides classifies into things that are bodily and, where the place where you're praying, physical things that may cause you, which we had some amusing discussions about various bodily functions that might do it. Sam, did you get the material that I sent out yesterday?
Yes, I think so.
Good.
2 pages, right?
Yeah, double-sided.
Right.
Anyway, so chapter 8 is about the people who are leading the prayers. And I thought there's a couple of interesting points here in Halakha 11 and 12. Irma, do you want to read the first one, Halakha 11? This is on page 3 from the material.
Only a person of great stature within the community, in both wisdom and deed, should be appointed as the leader of the congregation. If he is an older man, it is very praiseworthy. An effort should be made to appoint as the leader of the congregation someone who has a pleasant voice and is familiar with reading biblical verses. A person who does not have a full beard should not be appointed as the leader of the congregation, even if he be a wise man of great stature, as a gesture of respect to the congregation. However, he may recite the Shema publicly after he has reached the age of 13 and manifested signs of physical maturity.
Now, this is quite fascinating about what constitutes the right person to stand at the front. And of course, we looked last time. In the first part, I mentioned to you, responsa dealing with problematic cantors, but he's not talking about a cantor here. He's talking about on a day-to-day basis what is called in Hebrew the shaliach tzibur, which means the representative or agent of the public, meaning the person who stands for the community before God. And one of the important things about this person is that you have to understand, since there aren't printed prayer books, and only wealthy people could afford to have a prayer book, and there might be one prayer book for the whole congregation covering all the prayers of the year. Usually they're called a machzor, by the way, and we have several of them from the Middle Ages that still exist, mostly from European communities. So they had to know the prayers very well, and it meant that your average person needed to know the prayers off by heart, but let's not assume that everybody did, right? And so that's the reason for the shaliach tzibur, that a person would stand up there and pray for the whole congregation, and that when he came to the end of a blessing, the congregation, by responding Amen, in effect, is as if they had recited it. And that was the style of the way it was done. That's why it is so critical to have the right person. And when it says leader of the congregation, that's how it's translated as shaliach tzibur. Okay? Now, what's fascinating to me, that it was praiseworthy to have an older man do it, right? Presumably, this person really knows his stuff, and also there is, of course, a great respect for the older members of the community. Notice it's supposed to be a person with a pleasant voice. I'm going to say something here that is just a personal reflection, anecdotal. I have no evidence that this is the case, but when I was younger, when I first got back in a long time ago, when I first decided to become more observant. I grew up in a traditional conservative household, but we weren't fully observant. I attended, I was a student at Hebrew University in Israel, and I attended a lot of Hasidic services. And it always seemed, and did so a little bit afterwards when I came back too, it always seemed to me that their criteria was not the person with the best voice, but the one who seemed to be the most pious. And the most pious people seem to have the worst voice. So this is just a personal observation. But anyway, here he says it's really important that the person should have a good voice and is familiar with reading. And the square brackets say biblical verses, but I think it means the prayers, not primarily. I mean, the biblical verses in this case, I don't think is appropriate. Okay.
This was at a time after they had the vowels and they were singing. Is that correct?
Yes, this of course is. Well, look, the prayer service has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years by this point, and even although there is, of course, local variation, local prayers were often added by local religious poets and that sort of thing. So while there is sort of the core prayers were very well known, there was more than that in any particular community. And most people probably would not know those prayers. And when you get to the more specialized services, like the high holidays, then things get a little more complicated. And even to this day, right, leading high holiday services is very different from somebody who can stand up and lead a daily minyan. There are special melodies, there's all kinds of extra prayers, and so on and so forth. Notice he says a full beard, which means of a certain age. I think that's really what is referred to here. Because even the word for full beard is the same root as the word for elderly. Okay? So he may recite the Shema publicly after he has reached the age of 13, we would call bar mitzvah age, and has manifested signs of physical maturity, meaning beginning to show, hair on his face, right? So that's okay to lead certain parts of the prayers, even if the person is a teenager.
Do you pass muster with a trimmed Van Dyke?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting, Jews are often depicted in medieval drawings with beards. The question is, they don't necessarily look like, the way some Hasidic people do today with the long pious and the really long scraggly beards. So I'm in the assumption that people probably trimmed their beards to a certain extent. All right, read the next one. This is really interesting.
Similarly, the inarticulate who pronounce an aleph as an ayin, or an ayin as an aleph, for one who cannot articulate the letters in the proper manner, should not be appointed as the leader of a congregation.
Now, this is very interesting because today we don't distinguish between an ayin and an aleph. The way Hebrew is pronounced in Israel and in North America, and even the old Ashkenazic pronunciation, do not make a distinction between the ayin and the aleph. They're both pronounced as silent letters, when in fact we know that was not the case. And Yemenite Jews and some Jews from Iraq and other places actually sound out the ayin. It's a sound that's not found in English. It's a sound that's found in Arabic. There is an Arabic equivalent to the ayin. What's the sound? All right. Here's the best way to do it. You know the city of Gaza. Okay, that's the Greek pronunciation of it. In Hebrew, it's Azza with an ayin. I believe the way it's supposed to be pronounced is something like Azza. In other words, it's this kind of low guttural that is the letter that you often hear Arabic speakers do. But if you hear a Jew from Yemen speaking Yemenite Hebrew, not modern Hebrew, they will use that sound. So what's interesting is that in Maimonides' day, in Egypt, I cannot say my knowledge about what Jews in Europe were doing at this point, but definitely Jews in Egypt, who were, of course, Maimonides was Spanish, so they made a distinction between the two. And he thinks it's really important because it changes the meaning of the word, right? So that I thought was interesting. Read on.
A teacher may appoint one of his students to lead the prayers in his presence.
Now that's an important point, because normally you would think that the teacher is wiser and older than the students, and therefore all the time the teacher should lead, but permission is given to the student to lead the prayer, because don't forget, it's considered an honor to be a Shaliach Tzibur, and therefore you do not... Judaism is very important of what I will call respectful precedent. In other words, who gets to do what is important because it's a sign of respect to that person or to what we would call the office of that person, like a teacher, like a rabbi, like an elder, and so on and so forth. It's the reason why, the traditional way of calling people up for aliyot begins with a Kohen and then a Levi, and you're not supposed to call up a father before you call up a son before you call up a father. In other words, there's all kinds of these things that are based on Jewish attitudes of a hierarchy of respect, you might say. All right, read on.
A blind person may recite the Shema publicly and serve as the leader of a congregation.
Notice that. You don't, because, of course, if they know it off by heart, there's no reason why they can't do it. Go on.
A person whose shoulders are uncovered, though he may recite the Shema publicly, may not serve as the leader of the congregation until he is covered by a cloak.
That's an interesting point. And of course, that goes back to an earlier chapter where he talks about how if you're naked, you're not supposed to recite the prayers, right? So that I find to be some very interesting issues that we have here.
Here again, the cloak isn't a talus.
No, it's not. It's a general thing, and that's of course interesting that originally there wasn't a separate garment called a talit. What it was is that in rabbinic times people wore tunics, and then they had an overcloak like a toga kind of arrangement, and the toga, which was a normal everyday cloak, was the one that had to have the fringes on it. So it was just a normal garment.
When did the talit become?
I think it became common in the Middle Ages.
So the black dye from a snail, or the blue dye from a snail?
Oh no, that goes back because the fringes had to be on, if any square garment that you wore, which cloaks were, had to have the fringes on it. In other words, the law in the Torah, great sound there. The law in the Torah doesn't specify a separate garment. It just says on the corners of your garment. So any garment that has four corners technically needs a tzitzit on it.
So when did the fringes between the tzitzit become popular?
I don't know. That's a kind of conventional thing about, instead of hemming it up, they tied the ends of it. I don't know that. That's a good question.
So it's rabbinic, not biblical.
Well, in the days of the rabbis, people were still wearing a cloak as a everyday garment. I think in the Middle Ages, when you moved away from kind of Greco-Roman dress, you probably began to see the evolution of a special garment called the talit. And I honestly don't know if there are any surviving taluses from the Middle Ages. I don't know. I'm not personally familiar with that. It's a good question. I'll take a look, see if I can look it up.
Thank you.
All right, let's go back to the book for one chapter. This is page 92 in our anthology, where he's talking about, like the rest of the chapter is talking about sitting and standing and all kinds of different things about the Shaliach Tzibur. Yeah, Ed.
When you're raised, as I was, when you say the Shema, you stand. German, I guess, Orthodox.
It's Reform, actually. It's a Reform tradition.
It's a Reform tradition.
Yes, it's a Reform tradition that some conservative congregations adopted because traditionally the Shema was said sitting. We have very early evidence that the Shema was always said sitting as opposed to the Amida, which is called Amida because it means standing prayer, was done standing.
Right. But the Shema is the holiest of prayers.
Right, but there are certain midrashic justifications as to why you sit. But the fact of the matter is that, and when we get to the thing on synagogues, you'll see this, it was the custom in the Middle East to sit on the floor. not on a bench for the most part. I mean, at least in the Middle Ages. So the natural posture was sitting. The unusual posture was the standing up for the Amida. There's an old joke about that, by the way. I don't know if you heard. There's a congregation having a fight over whether they should stand or sit for the Amida. And half the congregation says sit, and the other half says stand. And it's really a bitter argument. And they decide, the rabbi decides he has to solve this. It's causing too much trouble. So they find the most elderly man in the congregation to find out what the original custom of the congregation is. And they found this man in a nursing home. Unfortunately, he wasn't, all there. And so they asked, the rabbi goes with a delegation and they ask him, was it the custom to sit or stand for the Shema? And the man says, I remember we fought about it. That was the tradition.
The Orthodox sit?
The Orthodox all sit. And conservatives sit.
And how about the Amida?
The Amida, everybody stands. That's, unless you're physically incapable of it, everybody stands for the Amida.
So is that more, is the Amida prayer more of a reverent prayer than the Shema?
No, it's a different kind of prayer. Remember, the Shema is not technically a prayer, it's a declaration. And the metaphoric structure of the Amida is you are standing before the king. You are going into the throne room of the king, and the king is the only one who gets to sit. And the Shema is the Pledge of Allegiance you say before you even get in there. You got to say your Pledge of Allegiance at the gate, so to speak. Hi, Paul, Ellie, did you get the material I sent out yesterday?
Yeah,
It's just a one-page double-sided or 2 pages. If not, I have a couple of, I have extra copies.
I have one.
Is this one here with the,
That's it.
you got it. Okay, good.
When, after the Amida,
Yes,
when the ark is opened, everybody stands.
yes, exactly.
And the first prayer is the Shema.
Right, and there's a reason for that, but it's not that Shema is not the official Shema. In other words, when you talk about the Shema being recited twice a day, the full Shema is recited in the morning service, that's before the Amida, and in the evening service before the Amida. There are a couple of other places in the service where just the first line of the Shema is recited. One is when we take the Torah out of the ark. One is in the Musaf Kedusha, for congregation do Musaf, and there is also the Shema you say before you go to bed. Those 3 other, and there's another time in the psuk, in the morning blessings. Those are not part of the official Shema. The reason why some of those were put in is precisely because people came to synagogue late and didn't say the Shema because they didn't make it in time, so they're saying it now. Seriously, that's probably the reason why it was done, especially the Musaf one. Okay, so let's take a look at page 92. Ed, how's your voice today? Not up to it? Okay, that's fine. So we'll let Paul and Ellie still settle down. So let's see. Why don't we start at the other side? Cal, why don't you pick it up?
Whoever says in his supplications, he that dealt mercifully with a nest of birds, forbidding the taking of the mother bird together with the nestlings, Deuteronomy, and the slaughtering of a beast and its young in one day, Leviticus, may he have mercy upon us. Or offers petitions of a similar character, is silenced. For these precepts are divine decrees set forth in Scripture and have not been ordained in a spirit of compassion. Were this the motive, the slaughtering of all animals would have been prohibited. It is also forbidden to multiply epithets and say, O God, great, mighty, awe-inspiring, powerful, puissant, since it is beyond human power to exhaust the praises of God. One should therefore limit himself to the attributes used by Moses, our teacher, peace be upon him.
Okay, so he has 2 issues here that are dealt with in the Talmud, in the Tractate on Prayer, and we actually looked at this for those of you who did the study of Tractate Brachot with me. One is somebody is during the time. Remember, there's in the earlier period, even in the Middle Ages, there was a certain amount of improvisation involved in saying the Amida by the Shaliach Tzibor. That originally there were just the blessings, and the paragraphs themselves were not fully set. So very often it was actually considered proper to improvise. So what happens if the Shaliach Tzibor all of a sudden mentions mercy by mentioning these two biblical verses, which seem to suggest a certain amount of mercy upon animals, birds, and beasts? What happens if they include it in the Amida? Now remember, or in his prayers, the Amida is completely human-centered. The prayers are really human-centered. They don't deal with, non-human creatures. What happens if he starts asking for God's mercy on birds and animals, right? Well, the Talmud says that person is silenced. In other words, somebody goes and stops the person from being the Shaliach Tzibor at that point, because he has included an improper prayer in the prayers. So, now Maimonides here mentions something he explicates in the guide in a much larger way. He said, where he talks about the meaning of these two laws. And for Maimonides, these two laws have nothing actually to do with the animal itself. He admits the fact, he says, that animals feel pain and suffering. And these two laws are meant to alleviate the pain and suffering on animals, but not for the animal's sake, but to teach us compassion. That if we are ill-treat animals, we are likely to ill-treat people. And then he says, and this is the same rationale he will write years later in the guide in a little longer form, were this the motive, the slaughtering of all animals would have been prohibited. If God had great mercy upon animals, we would not be allowed to eat them for food. That's his reason why. It's a very interesting point, isn't it?
We all be vegetarians.
Exactly. The Torah would say, and as we know at the beginning of Genesis, in fact, that's what it does say, that the human is only to eat vegetables, but after Noah, humans are allowed to eat meat. We're on page 92.
Why after Noah?
Because the world has changed after Noah. In other words, if you look in chapter 9 of Genesis, you will see that God specifically allows humans to eat animals, okay, but prohibits the eating of blood. Okay, so the world is not quite as perfect as it was at the beginning, and because there is now death, humans are allowed to eat animals and kill creatures, whereas at the beginning of Genesis, they're not allowed to. Presumably in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve only ate fruit and vegetables. So, because in a perfect world, there is no death, no killing of any kind. And when you look, for example, at chapter 11 of Isaiah, when he prophesies the future Messianic era, the world will revert back to that, where it says the lion shall lie down with the lamb, and so on and so forth, because there will be no predators anymore. Nothing will kill. Humans won't kill. Animals won't kill. But Maimonides is dealing with the real world, and he says the Torah doesn't prohibit us from eating animals. In fact, we've got the rules of kashrut and other things. And so anybody who stands up there and claims God's compassion on animals the same way as they are for humans should be silenced. Yes?
Which book is that?
This is Halachot Tefillah, chapter 9, Halakha 7. Okay? Yep. Now, the second issue, also dealt with in the Talmud, the beginning of the Amida begins, right? Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, right? The God of our ancestors, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Then it says, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, v'Hanorah. The great, the mighty, the awe-inspiring, the awe-inspiring, okay? And these very particular words come out of the Torah. I think in Deuteronomy, Moses uses them to talk about God. So they are the words of Moses. Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanorah. 4 words, right? What happens if somebody gets up there and gets carried away and starts adding all kinds of words to that, right? In other words, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanorah, V'Hachazak, V'Ha'amitz, and so on and so forth. He gives like several others. And again, the Talmud specifically says someone should be silent. Now, the Talmud probably thinks the reason for doing that is you don't change something that comes from the Torah, right? But notice Maimonides' answer. It is beyond human power to exhaust. Well, actually, the Talmud sort of says the same thing. It's beyond human power to exhaust the praises of God. In other words, it's kind of stupid. We have to say these words because they're the words of Moses. But in fact, what Maimonides says is they're meant to limit the terms we refer to God as. Because human language cannot possibly, encompass the totality of God. And when you go to the guide, which is the reference here, you'll see that in the guide, Maimonides goes on in a great way to say, as part of his whole discussion of the rationale as to why God asked for sacrifices, that in effect, the perfect form of worship is wordless meditation on God. Because human language cannot possibly, and that's part of his whole program in the early part of the guide to show that all human descriptions of God are metaphorical and don't really tell us something about God in essence. So he's alluding to this similar idea, which he hasn't written yet when he wrote the Mishneh Torah, but he's going to write about in the guide some years later. Yes, Cantor?
The discussion on the steps forward and backward.
Yeah.
He takes it from the Talmud?
Yeah, he's getting, most of the stuff is from the Talmud.
So in the Talmud, how they get into the discussion originally?
I honestly don't remember, but the notion, the metaphor is if you're walking into the, it's the king, right? You don't turn your back on the king when you leave the term. Yeah, there's a discussion in the Talmud, yeah.
And he won't give you, obviously, where it is.
No, but if, you have this
edition will...
Yeah, somebody's got a note here, it tells you exactly where it is. Essentially most of this stuff regarding prayer is in Masechet Brachot. That's where all this discussion is. Okay, so we've done all right, so now we're going to go to chapter 11. So we keep in the book for the minute. All right, Cal, you want to keep reading?
Wherever there are 10 Israelites resident, an edifice must be fitted up, where they can assemble for worship at each period of prayer. Such a building is termed a synagogue. The residents exercise compulsory powers on each other for the purpose of erecting a synagogue and purchasing a scroll of the law, the prophetical books, and the hagiography.
Okay, so an edifice so they can assemble for worship, and of course the verb there to assemble is the same Hebrew word for synagogue, which is Beit Knesset, house of assembly. Okay, so what he's saying is that where there is a minyan, there is the Jews must create a Beit Knesset. Okay, and he says the residents exercise compulsory powers, meaning they can in effect force each other to, I would say, a communal tax to pay for a synagogue building or outfitting a building as a synagogue, and buying a Torah scroll, books of the prophets, which of course were written in separate scrolls, and books of the writings, the book of Psalms and all the other scrolls. In other words, a whole Tanakh. Have any of you ever seen, by the way, scrolls of the prophets written like a Torah scroll? No, I'm talking about like real physical, actual physical books. The first congregation I served in the system had a full set of them.
So each prophet is.
Well, what they had is they had a scroll for Isaiah, they had a scroll for Ezekiel, they had a scroll for Jeremiah, and they had one scroll for the 10 minor prophets.
Well,
It was amazing because that meant that originally people said the Haftarot out of those scrolls rather than out of a printed book. And occasionally you still come across that, but they're very rare
How
these
come that-
days.
like Esther remained in a scroll just because it's called scroll?
Because it's called a scroll and you read it as a scroll. Yeah, Esther is one of the few where it's required to read. It's required to read Esther out of a scroll like a Torah, but the others don't have to be. Not even like the other Megillot that you recite, like Shira Shirim and stuff like that.
Is the Torah a requirement?
Yeah, the Torah's a requirement to be a scroll. If you don't have a Torah scroll and you're reading out of a printed Torah, you're not allowed to say the blessings.
Okay.
Okay? But it's interesting that occasionally you still come across congregations that have sets of, very rarely, the congregation that I was the assistant at was a amalgamation of two earlier congregations, and those scrolls must have gone back to like the 20s or 30s.
So that's also from the Talmud, the discussion in the Talmud, the thing with the.
Yeah, that's probably a Masechet Megillah. Yeah.
Okay.
So is it the Talmud that says you must only read the Torah from a scroll?
I think it was already a long established practice before that. In other words,
It's a custom, basically.
it became a law. I mean, the question is, when the codex, when the book form came around, I think it's the 4th century CE, why didn't Jews just adopt the codex? Because before that, all books were scrolls, right? So it wasn't special. So why didn't Jews adopt the idea that their Bible readings, their Torah readings in the synagogue should be used out of a codex that could be put into the ark, a special codex, and so on and so forth? Why did they retain this archaic idea of maintaining a scroll for the Torah when they were adopting the codex for all other kinds of books? It's a kind of conservative attitude when you're talking about ritual, when you're talking about sacred objects. So what they rejected the idea of turning the Torah into a codex.
I know that this is going to come about.
Yeah, they had no idea, right. And they wanted to maintain it because something that's old-fashioned has a higher level of sacredness than something that's new. Cantor picked up a smartphone, exactly. Think about taking a smartphone out of the ark and reading out of a smartphone or a tablet. It would seem weird, wouldn't it? It wouldn't have the same sense of holiness carrying around a tablet and everybody trying to kiss it. I mean, it just sounds absurd, right? But it would be the same as if, you took a beautiful copy of the Tanakh, handwritten even, not even printed.
The body, the actual physical body.
But they could have, but the physical body of a book was still a physical body before printing, right? Don't forget also, when printing came along, you couldn't use a printed scroll, right? You could have created a scroll printed, just every sheet printed out. They rejected printing. It's this notion of maintaining an archaic form which helps to create a sense of sacredness. And by the way, that's true of the structure of synagogues, as hopefully we'll get to today. All right. Cal, you want to read number 4?
Synagogues and houses of study must be treated with respect. They are swept and sprinkled to lay the dust. In Spain and the West, Morocco, in Babylon and in the Holy Land, it is customary to kindle lamps in the synagogues and to spread mats on the floor on which the worshippers sit. In the lands of Edom, Christian countries, they sit in synagogues on chairs or benches.
Okay, so here Maimonides shows that already by his day there is a very distinct difference between Sephardic synagogues and Ashkenazic synagogues, right? That in Ashkenaz they have adopted the idea of sitting on chairs and benches. By the way, some of the ancient synagogues that have been found, people also sat on benches. I mean, if you take a look at one of the oldest synagogues in existence, the one at Masada, there are benches there. So what's interesting is Jews in Sephardic countries, in fact, adopted the Arabic, the Muslim style of sitting on the floor, when very likely in earlier synagogues, they probably, like in the Second Temple period or post Second Temple period prior to the Muslim conquest, there were communities that sat in benches and chairs and some that sat on the floor. In other words, it wasn't necessarily so in there wasn't that split. But notice there's definitely a split here.
Where do you take that thing with the sitting on chairs or on the floor?
Well, I think it's the influence of Islam.
No, but where is it in the text?
It's chapter 11, halacha 4.
4?
Oh yeah. So we actually
It
skipped.
says row, but it doesn't say chairs or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, that's what obviously he meant according to the translation.
It says the direction of that they're facing,
Yeah.
and then it says they're sitting in rows.
Right.
And they're facing the holiness, which is the
Oh yeah. Don't forget the numbering there is not always recited.
No, but I think here it is corresponding to the same.
Yeah.
I mean 11:4.
Actually, in the Hebrew here, it says it's actually number 5. Again, sometimes the numbering of his paragraphs are different depending upon the edition, and the one that I have says, "V'noagim kol Yisrael b'sfarad u'b'ma'arav," right? U'v'shinar.
Oh, I don't have that.
That's number 5. Okay, is to sit
yeah,
on the
yeah.
floor, right? Bakarka,
Machzalot, yeah.
bakarkan, right? And then it says, "Uva'are Edom yoshvim ba al hakisot, kisaot."
Yes.
Okay,
Got it. Thank you.
so there it is. All right, we skipped the extra ones I gave you, which I actually want to do now as well. So Sam, you want to pick up the extra material, which numbers 2, 3, and actually Tversky doesn't give you the first half of halacha 4, which actually it should be halacha 5. I don't know why.
Let me ask you a question about
Yeah.
chapter 12. first.
Yeah. Oh, we'll get to chapter 12.
Oh, okay then.
All right, I want to do chapter 11 first. And because here we're going to talk about the synagogue, and I want to give you a little bit about that. So we skipped, so let's go back to halacha 2. Remember, he says in halacha 1 that it's a requirement that if you've got 10 Jews sitting together, this is the material I just sent you, by the way, you've got to build a synagogue and you can tax people to do it. So, Sam, you want to read, it says, when a synagogue is built,
When a synagogue is built, it should be built only at the highest point of the city, as implied by Proverbs, quote, "She cries at the head of the public places," unquote. It should be built so that its height exceeds that of all the other buildings in the city, as implied by Ezra, to lift up the house of our God.
stop there. This is very interesting. The verse from Proverbs, the she in Proverbs is chokhmah, wisdom, which the rabbis, of course, identified with Torah. So therefore, Torah has to be the head, the rosh, the highest place. What's interesting is that this is, of course, comes from the Talmud, but the reality was that in Muslim community, in the Muslim Empire and in the Christian communities, Jews were not allowed to build synagogues to be the highest building in the area. In fact, there were specific prohibitions.
In what period?
In the whole medieval period, Jews were not allowed to build synagogues higher than mosques and churches. There were specific prohibitions. And in fact, that's the reason why, for example, when you go to Jerusalem, there are these famous, in the Jewish quarter, there are these famous 4 synagogues that are all interconnected, these old synagogues. Why? They're slightly below ground so that they can have a high enough roof, but they're not higher than any of the local mosques in the neighborhood. Okay? So this is the ideal. This is not the way things were actually done in the Middle Ages in any places. If you look at any of the ancient synagogues that still exist, and there are about a dozen or so of them that still exist from the Middle Ages in Europe, in Spain, in Arab countries, none of the synagogues are built really tall because they weren't allowed to. Okay. Read the next one.
The entrance to the synagogue should open only on the east, as implied by Numbers, quote, "and those who camped before the sanctuary on the east," unquote. In the synagogue, a
Heichal,
heichal, where the Torah scroll is placed, should be constructed. The Heichal should be constructed in the direction to which the people pray in that city, so that they will face the Heichal when they stand to pray.
Now, that's very interesting. They're saying the door should open on the east, the door to the synagogue. Meaning, now there's a conflict here, of course, with if the Heichal is what we call the ark. The Heichal is a permanent ark. It's a niche. And it has to be on the wall in the direction of which people pray, which means towards Jerusalem. Now, depending upon where your community is, that could be on a different wall. So in Iran, the Heichal would be on the west wall. So it's okay, the entrance can be on the east. But in places in the west where the Heichal, the ark, is on the east wall, how can you have the entrance on the same side? That doesn't make sense. And in fact, that wasn't the case. Now, in the ancient synagogues, the pre-rabbinic synagogues, the door was often on the east wall, no matter where they were, because, of course, the sun would come in from there. And originally, in the earliest synagogues that we found, they don't face in any particular direction. What happened is that as the synagogue evolved after the destruction of the Second Temple, in some places, the door faced Jerusalem. But eventually, the idea that the ark should be on the wall that faces Jerusalem became common. So if you look at some of the synagogues, the ancient synagogues in the Galilee, the Heichal, the ark niche, is on the south wall. Okay? So this is not always the case. And by the way, you will see he makes a distinction between a Heichal and an Aron. Today we call it the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark. But here he's making a distinction of two different kinds. The Heichal is a permanent niche for the Torah. The Aron is a cabinet that's movable. Because originally, and this is in the Talmud, there was no permanent ark. The Torahs were kept in a cabinet, which was carried into the synagogue when they wanted to read the Torah. In other words, it was a storage cabinet, and it was portable.
Which way do they face within Jerusalem itself?
Depends on where the temple is.
So they face towards the temple.
Face towards the temple. In the southern part of the city, it faces north.
Is facing is that way.
Well, yeah, exactly. The temple door
It's
faced east.
Okay.
So the sun would come right through into the Holy of Holies. Okay?
And was there a Heichal there?
No, there was the Holy of Holies. That was the center of the temple, right? That was where in the first temple period the Ark of the Covenant
That's
was.
the reason for the western wall. Because
Right.
It's closer to the.
To the Holy of Holies,
To
the
the
Kodesh
west side.
HaKodashim, right.
So the wall becomes more holy because it's closer.
Exactly.
To the Holy of
So read the next one, number 3. A platform.
A platform was placed in the center of the hall, so that the one who reads the Torah or one who gives a sermon can stand on it, so that all the others will hear him. When one positions the teva, which contains the Torah scroll, one should position it in the center of the hall, in the direction of the Heichal and facing the people.
Okay, so again, the teva here is what we call the aron, and is a portable cabinet to carry the Torah scroll. Notice he's making a distinction between that and the Heichal. The Heichal means palace and refers to, in other words, it's an attempt to be like a kind of symbolic representation of the Holy of Holies. Today we put this all together in what we call the Ark. And then take a look on the back, because I've given you two plans of old synagogues. There are some, and when I put this up on YouTube next week, I suggest you look at it because I have found a number of pictures of synagogues, including ones that are from Spain. Okay? And what you have to understand is the architecture, the outside architecture of synagogues varied considerably depending upon the country. It often reflected the style of the country. The interior of the synagogue tended to be fairly much the same based on these rules, but there were nonetheless differences. So take a look at the first diagram, which is the Alt-Neuschule, which is the famous synagogue in Prague. If any of you been to Prague and been to the Alt-Neuschule? Yeah. The Alt-Neuschule was built in the 13th century in two different stages. And if you take a look, you see the arrow points north. On the right side, you see the Torah, the ark is that little, rectangle in the middle of the wall. It's a permanent ark made of stone, right? And notice it's facing the eastern, it's on the eastern wall, okay? Now, if you take a look, you'll see the dark is the central wall of the sanctuary, and the cross pieces, by the way, are it's a Gothic synagogue. In other words, it's got Gothic ceilings, but if you count up the arches, the Gothic churches had 4 vaults, which formed a cross. The Alt-Neuschule doesn't do that because it doesn't want to form a cross up at the top, right? You'll see, in fact, it's like 8, okay? And you'll notice that the main entrance is on the south wall, and there is a kind of foyer area outside of it, all right? Because over on the north part there is what is considered the women's gallery, where it's this long room here where there are breaks or windows between it and the main part. That was the women's part. I believe that the original building, because it was built in 2 stages, was the part that just in front of the entrance, that it was originally just a small, long building, and then they built on the rest of it a little later. But it dates from the 13th century, so it's one of the oldest surviving synagogues in Christian Europe. Okay. Now, I could not find any diagrams of any of the ancient synagogues in Spain or Egypt, but I did get pictures. So when I put this up on YouTube, if you want to see pictures of some of the old synagogues from Spain and a couple from Egypt, because there is a synagogue in Egypt, it's very old and is reputed to have been the synagogue that Maimonides went in, but I could not find a diagram of it.
We visited a synagogue in Fez, in Morocco.
Yes.
And it was within a community as if it was somebody's home.
Right.
And it was a square room in the back where only the men were. And it was during one of the high holidays. I'm not sure whether it was Sukkot. I'm not sure what it was. I don't remember. But several of us walked in there during their prayers, during the service, and there were seats along the outside, benches along the outside of the room.
Right.
And in the center was a square bima where the cantor and the rabbi were reading and praying.
Yes.
And it was just very interesting.
Well,
they had lights around the wall, electric lights, which were covered by a white bulb on which was Hebrew lettering, Hebrew words, on each of the different words, on each of the white bulbs.
Well, you see that in old synagogues, Eastern European style synagogues too, where the Hebrew letters would be on the thing. You'll notice, for example, there's the number of windows. There's a number of windows here, right? There's supposed to be 12 windows in a synagogue, according to the Talmud, to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. I don't think there are 12 here. But the Alt-Neuschule is very thick walls, obviously, because often these medieval synagogues, especially in Europe, were almost like little fortresses, as a place where Jews could go if there were riots. The bima is in the middle in the Alt-Neuschule. Mm-hmm. And that was the tradition, as you see, that in most synagogues there is some kind, and one of the things that I will put up on YouTube is a picture from an illuminated manuscript from a prayer book showing the Jews at prayer inside a synagogue, and you see this elaborate bima with with a canopy over it where somebody is leading the prayers from. It's quite beautiful and fascinating. I think it's a 15th century prayer book. I don't remember. You'll see it when I put it up. But that was what was most common, was the idea that you have this platform in the middle where the Torah is read from, and he said where somebody gives a sermon, but the person leading the prayers did not usually do it from that bima. Instead, there was usually a place near the ark, usually to the side of the ark, that in some cases was lower than the floor slightly, because the idea of calling out from the depths was with a lectern there. And you see this in Eastern European synagogues. Like if you go to the Eldridge Street Synagogue, you'll see it there. Very likely, and that's where the actual prayer leader chanted from, not from the bima. The bima was only for reading the Torah and for sermons, as he mentions in the source here. Interestingly enough.
So the men were wearing derbies, black derbies.
Oh, well, yes. In certain synagogues, in one synagogue in London, the men wore top hats. Take a look. In this material I've given you, Halakha 4 is in fact not given in Torsky, but in fact it's the beginning of Halakha 4. How do people sit in the synagogue? This is really interesting. Cal, you want to read that too? Sam, you want to read that too?
How do the people sit in the synagogue? The elders sit facing the people with their backs towards the Heichal. All the people sit row after row, each row facing the back of the row before it. Thus all the people face the sanctuary, the elders and the teva. When the leader of the congregation stands to pray, he stands on the ground before the teva, facing the sanctuary like the others.
So that's interesting. The elders sit facing the people with their backs to the Heichal, usually, and that was true. They would, and you see this even today in many synagogues, where the rabbi's chair and the chair where the president sits is on the bima to the sides of the ark facing towards everybody else. This is a very old custom.
Bima guests.
The bima guests, right. But here the elders of the congregation, right? And he says the people sit row on row, each row facing the back of the row before it. Thus all people face the sanctuary, the elders and the teva. He is suggesting everybody is seated, again, on the ground in his case, all facing forward. But we know that in many congregations they would sit on three sides around, the way they're structured around around it, which was the case in the Altneu Shul, and in many Eastern European style synagogues. That's what you have. The bima is in the middle, and you have chairs on three sides, and then there's a women's gallery in the back facing forward. Okay. So one other interesting thing, though, is the second diagram I've given you is a Sephardic synagogue in Venice. Because after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, there were a fair number of them went to Italy. And so in Venice, you find, there were three separate communities. There were the indigenous Venetian Jews, there were Ashkenazic Jews, and there were Spanish Jews, and they all had their own synagogues.
Naturally.
Well, to give you an example, there was a very famous Haggadah printed in Venice in 1609, I believe, 1608, something like that. I have a facsimile of it. And it's a beautiful Haggadah. Every page has columns on the sides. And were three separate editions of it. The Hebrew of the Haggadah, of the Seder, is in the middle, and in the pillars, written in Hebrew letters, were the translation. One edition it was Yiddish, one edition it was Judeo-Italian, and one edition it was Ladino, the vernacular of the Spanish Jews, because the printers knew they could sell the Haggadah to all three communities, right? So that's what you had in Venice. So the Spanish synagogue, the synagogue of the Spanish Jews in Venice, was originally built in the 16th century, and this is what it looks like. this kind of structure is unique to Italy, where the bema is at the back. See, down in the bottom? And the ark is in the other side. And by the way, if you take a look where north is, the bema is in fact on the southeast wall. And that probably is just because of where they could get the property.
The north is facing down, isn't it?
No, north. Well, if you put it the upside down and you face north,
So, but the
that means that that the ark is on the southeast wall.
Yes,
Southeast wall.
so the beamer's on the northern wall.
Sorry, the bema's on the north wall. That's right. So the point is that that's probably because of where the property they get. This was the best they could do. But the fact is, notice the way it is, where the benches all face towards the middle. There's this big open aisle, which allows for great processions from the ark to the bema, and the women's galleries are on the sides, up above the benches.
The one in Florence is huge building that has a history with the Second World War, with the Nazis.
I don't remember
I've
that.
been there.
Yeah,
like,
I've never been there.
years ago.
Yeah, what did it look like in the middle?
I think it's similar. There were we were there on Shabbat. There
Yeah.
were very few people. I
Right,
think they were praying from the center, like doing the actual
right,
singing. And we were, of course, sitting in the, like on kind of side, long ways on the side, women.
right.
And the men were handling the.
Right, but you find a lot of Italian synagogues are structured like this. Like
Yeah,
here
very similar.
in the Israel Museum, they have a couple of complete synagogues that are actually inside the museum in Jerusalem. One of them is an Italian synagogue from some small community that no longer exists, and they took it apart and rebuilt it in the museum. It looks like this. It's a lot.
And there's a whole story how they saved it from the Nazis.
Yeah. I think they took it apart and all kinds of things. The point is that this is for some reason, and I don't know enough about synagogue architecture to know why, but this was very common in Italian synagogues. What's interesting is when you look at some of the Spanish synagogues that still exist from the late Middle Ages, which were converted into churches, they're sort of very open, broad things with arches. Any of you been there to any of them? The El Transito in Toledo, and there's also one in Cordova. Cal, do you want to tell us about it?
It's been long.
Oh, okay. Do you remember anything?
No.
I wish I could.
Large open space with Hebrew inscriptions
Right.
running around the wall.
And a whole series of like pillared arcades and stuff like that. So I couldn't find a diagram of it like this to be able to sort of figure out its orientation, but it's very different than you find in other places.
Yeah, also in Toledo at Santa Maria la Blanca,
Yes.
which has been either a church, a synagogue,
Right.
or a mosque, depending. It's a huge open space.
Right. Which suggests that perhaps there was no permanent niche, that they brought, that the Torah was brought in a portable cabinet, and that people sat on the floor, and who knows? I mean, and the bema could have been some kind of wooden structure that didn't survive the various changes over to a church. I don't know enough about it, and I could not find a floor plan of it online. So that this is interesting stuff, isn't it?
I just have a question on
Yeah.
the rectangular one. There are these large arrows pointing away from the bema, left and right.
Oh, those are stairs
I
going
realize-
down. It says stairs to synagogue something.
So you enter the bema from the front.
Yeah,
There's two stairs on each side.
Yeah.
You leave on the side.
yeah, I think so.
But it seems strange that the arrows are so prominent.
Yeah, I don't know why those are there as part of the plan. I really don't know. Okay, so let's go back to the book. Actually, wait a sec. Sorry, let's go to your sheets from last week, chapter 11, halacha 6. This is interesting. This is about behavior in the synagogue. It's on page 3 of the material I gave you last week. Chapter 11, halacha 6. Ed, do you want to read that? No lightheadedness?
No lightheadedness, that is, jests, frivolity, and idle conversation should be seen in a synagogue. We may not eat or drink inside a synagogue, nor use the synagogue for our benefit, nor stroll inside one. On a sunny day, one should not enter a synagogue to seek shade from the sun. And on a rainy day, one should not enter a synagogue to seek shelter from the rain. However, the sages and their students are permitted to eat and drink in a synagogue because of the difficulty observing the prohibition.
Which would cause them. Well, sorry, which should be
Observing the prohibition would cause them.
Yeah, exactly. So the synagogue is supposed to be a holy place. The synagogue was not the kind of place that a modern synagogue is, that has a social hall. Celebrations occurred somewhere else. And that was true, by the way, for a lot of synagogues, even in the middle 20th century. They did not have extensive social halls, and that was done off-site. And because the synagogue was to be used strictly for places of prayer and study, which is why they allow teachers and students to eat there. What's interesting is that probably some of the original synagogues probably often had a broader sense of purpose. They were sometimes used as hostels for travelers. They were in Eretz Yisrael. Because they're called Beit Knesset, they were likely what we would consider community centers, local town halls, where Jews would gather. The town would gather to discuss civic business. The idea of a synagogue as strictly a place of prayer is actually a diaspora phenomenon. In other words, the earliest archaeological evidence of synagogues, which comes from inscriptions from Egypt, it's not called a synagogue, synagoges. It's called a prosuche, a prayer place. So very likely the earliest synagogues in the diaspora were small places that were strictly devoted to prayer and reading Torah. In Eretz Yisrael, the earliest synagogues were probably community centers and civic centers. What happens is that all these various functions begin to mold together. In other words, the synagogue as a single Jewish place of prayer and study and assembly, that evolved from separate institutions. But by the Middle Ages, it was, of course, the central building for the Jewish community. But it's interesting that celebrations did not take place there. There were communities that often had separate buildings, separate study houses, by the way, from the synagogue. They didn't necessarily do the studies. In fact, they have found ruins of some of these ancient yeshivot. The most prominent one that they have found, actually there aren't that many that have been found, is in Rouen in Normandy.
Would he talk about like funerals? Because I know in the Sephardi community, you're not allowed to bring the dead.
If you look in his Laws of Mourning, they didn't use the synagogue for funerals. They did it at the cemetery. And that was, by the way, in North America, that was very often the custom too. You go to some of the older cemeteries, and you will see little buildings there at the entrance to the synagogue where they would that's where the service would be held. Right? This idea of funeral homes or doing things in the synagogue is a fairly recent thing. In fact, the halakha says that only very prominent people's funerals are allowed to be done in the synagogue. And some congregations still uphold that concept. What's interesting is in Toronto, and this is from a more, and I'm using the term politically rather than gender, there was a very egalitarian approach to this, and somehow the custom in all the Toronto synagogues, regardless of denomination, was every member could choose to have their funeral in the synagogue. The idea that only prominent people didn't like that idea. It was too autocratic for them.
Where was that?
In Toronto, that's still the prevailing custom.
Also by us, it's the same thing.
Yeah?
You have to be a member.
Yes, you have to be a member. Now, it is true there are funeral homes in Toronto, and a lot of people have their funerals in the funeral home if there's a conflict of something going on. But, if a member wants to have their funeral in the synagogue, they can have it in the synagogue.
Yeah, Yeah, but in the Sephardics, I think it's because of the Kedushat.
Yeah, there's all kinds of reasons. I mean, really, in a certain sense, it doesn't make any sense to have a funeral in a synagogue to bring the dead body into the building. You're right. It's sort of yeah. But anyway, it shows you changing attitudes towards these things. All right, read number 7. It is forbidden.
It is forbidden to calculate accounts in a synagogue, unless the accounts are connected with a mitzvah. For example, the collection of charity, the redemption of captives, or the like. Similarly, eulogy should not be recited inside the synagogue, except a eulogy that involves many of the inhabitants of the city. For example, if there were a eulogy of the great sages of that city, for which all the people would gather together and come.
So there again it is, right? You don't do a eulogy in a synagogue, right? But notice, you're not supposed to do business in a synagogue. I can tell you how many people are in violation of this, right? No matter what the denomination, people are talking business all the time. But you're not supposed to do that.
They're just talking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
If there were cell phones, he would probably add that also.
Yes, I'm sure he would. Let's now look to chapter 12 on page 92.
Nor would they allow television
Right.
transmission of
Right.
service.
Right. Go to chapter 12 on page 92. This is the first halakha, which talks about the Torah readings being established. Paul, you want to read that? Moses, our teacher. This is the bottom page.
Moses, our teacher, established the rule for Israel that they should read the law publicly on Sabbaths and also on the 2nd and 5th days of the week during the morning service, so that there should be 3 days shall not elapse without hearing the law. Ezra established the rule that the Torah should be read at the afternoon service every Sabbath for the benefit of those who would otherwise spend the day vacuously. He also ordained that in the 2nd and 5th days of the week, 3 persons should be called to the reading of the Torah, and they should read not fewer than 3 verses each.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
I thought it was Ezra when people returned to Israel from Babylonia.
Yeah.
I think it says so in the Torah that he decided that people.
No, it's not in the Torah. It's in the book of Nehemiah.
Oh, okay.
But it's in the Bible. Yeah.
Okay, that people should not stand on the corner and gossip, and therefore he held Torah reading. I think Tuesday and Thursday, was it? I'm not sure.
It doesn't say anything of that sort in the Torah.
No.
What it does is that Ezra, in chapter 8 of the book of Nehemiah, you have the first evidence for the Torah being read publicly in its entirety. But the rabbinic tradition ascribes a lot of things to Ezra. In fact, in the rabbinic tradition, Ezra is like a second Moses in some ways. So notice, he's reflecting the historiography of the rabbis, that Moses was the one who first established the notion of reading the Torah publicly. And there is in the book of Deuteronomy this notion of reading the book of Deuteronomy periodically, but it doesn't say anywhere that you should be reading it on the Sabbath and on Mondays and Thursdays. But the rabbinic tradition ascribes through the oral tradition that Moses was the one that did this, but that Ezra also adds certain other rules. And this is in a lot of circumstances. Ezra is really seen as a kind of second Moses. So he fixed the notion of reading on Shabbat afternoon, where you start the next week's Parsha, and also that you should only have 3 people called to the reading of the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays, and that's true also the Saturday afternoon, and that what they read is not a long section, but the minimum number of verses for any aliyah is 3.
Oh, even on Shabbat, there's that's the minimum? Or?
Yes, in other words, if you, like in some synagogues, they add aliyot because of all kinds of honors, but the additional aliyot have to be a minimum of 3 verses. That's the rule.
Where is the 7 come? But that's Shabbat.
No, I'm talking about the verses, the psukim, the actual
But
number.
that's true for Shabbat too, or no?
Yeah, it's true. If there's no aliyah that's shorter than 3 verses on Shabbat.
No, but I'm saying you don't need to divide everything into 7?
No, you're talking about the aliyot. I'm talking about the number of psukim.
Yeah, me too.
No, every aliyah is a minimum of 3 verses
On any given day.
on any given day.
Okay.
Okay?
Question.
Yeah.
On the day in the time of Moses, were there 5 books?
In Moses' day himself, there wasn't even one book.
So,
I'm talking here about the rabbinic
okay.
understanding of history, not the way scholars understand it.
It's codified in the year 200, right?
No, by the time of Ezra, it was codified pretty much the way we've got it. In other words, the public reading of the Torah in 444 BCE, which is reported in the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah, is probably they're reading the Torah pretty much what we got now. Okay? There may have been some editing after that, but the editing of the Torah, the way we have it, is from the 5th century BCE, not from the time of Moses.
So Maimonides must obviously knew this.
No, he didn't know this. He only knew what the rabbinic tradition said. I'm talking about what modern scholars. I mean, he's a medieval Jew. He doesn't know modern critical analysis of the Bible. Okay, take a look now at chapter 12 on page 3 of the material I gave you.
Did he talk about the triennial cycle and all that?
He did actually already in the material. He says that it's our tradition to recite it. By his day, there were only a few Jews were doing the 3-year cycle. Everybody had adopted the Babylonian.
So nowadays it's a return to that old...
Yeah, but it's a different form of triennial today that people do than the original Palestinian. Don't forget, the original Eretz Yisrael tradition was to divide up, in effect, every parsha that we have into what they call the Sidarim, and they're a third shorter. So you would start 1 year at Bereshit, but it would take you 3 years to get to the end of Devarim. The modern triennial readings are you're reading a little bit from each one every year, right? Yeah, exactly. All right, so Ellie, do you want to start reading the bottom of page 3, Halakha 10, from the time of Ezra?
From the time of Ezra, it was customary that a translator would translate to the people the passages read by the reader from the Torah, so that they would understand the subject matter. The reader should read 1 verse alone and remain silent while the translator translates it. Afterwards, he should read a 2nd verse. The reader is not permitted to read to the translator more than 1 verse at a time.
This was the way the Torah was read. Verse in Hebrew, translator. Verse in Hebrew, translator. In fact, he says from the time of Ezra, here he is looking at chapter 8 of the book of Nehemiah, where it says that the Torah was read and it was translated and explained as it was being read, because by that time most Jews didn't understand Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic. So the traditional Aramaic translation, called the Targum, was the one that was done. Now, by the time of Maimonides, the question that I don't know the answer to is, were their translators just using the Aramaic translation, or were they doing it into Arabic? Probably into Arabic, because we know that in France, they were translating it into medieval French. And the only community that has continued to use this is the Yemenites.
To use this?
The translator. You go to a Yemenite synagogue in Israel, and first of all, every adult male in the Yemenite community, traditionally, is taught how to read the Torah. Okay? They do it Friday nights. They go around, and all the men in the family, verse by verse by verse, they go through the whole parsha, and they teach the little boys how to do it. So every male that's called to the Torah for an aliyah chants his own passage, which was the original way it was done. Whereas the idea of having a Torah reader is a little later. Okay, so when you go to Yemenite synagogue, a guy's called up, because it's all men, called up to the Torah. He chants a verse. There's a kid usually below the age of bar mitzvah, who's standing at a little lectern beside the table where the Torah is read, who chants a verse from the Targum, the Aramaic. They've produced remained with a 2,500-year-old custom. They don't translate it into Aramaic. They translate it into Aramaic, which I'm sure most of the Yemenite Jews don't understand Aramaic. But they've preserved this old thing. So you hear, and then the kid, and then that, and the kid. At first, when I went to a Yemenite synagogue for the first time as a student at Hebrew University, I had no idea what was going on. And then I realized it, and I was like amazed that this custom was still preserved. But in France and in other places, they translated it into the local vernacular. But that custom died out in Europe.
Because they read it straight in German? No.
No, they just read it. I'm talking by the late Middle Ages that people stopped doing that. They just read it in Hebrew. And possibly, I don't know whether printed books had an impact on this when books were, but the whole idea of reading and translated died out, and now because everybody sits with a translation in front of them, you don't need it, right? Yeah,
When
Sam.
one is in the midst of a Torah service and sitting and looking at our books, which read in Hebrew and in English.
Yeah.
Is it more of a mitzvah to read it in Hebrew, follow the chanting, or to read it in English? And understand, assuming you don't understand Hebrew.
I think it's a little of both. In other words, I think what's more important is to understand what's being read. Okay? And that's the reason why they use translators. Right? And notice it said, so the people would understand the subject matter. And by the way, that notion of translating and explaining was also the beginning of the Devar Torah, the sermon. The notion that you stood up there and you explained what the Torah reading was about. It wasn't enough just to translate it. You had to explain it as well. All right? Let's take a look at number 11 on the next page. Ellie, you were reading, right?
The reader is not permitted to raise his voice above that of the translator, nor should the translator raise his voice above that of the reader. The translator is not permitted to begin translating until the reader completes reading the verse, nor may the reader begin reading another verse until the translator has completed the translation. The translator should not lean on a beamer or on a pillar. Rather, he should stand with awe and fear. He should not translate from a written text, but rather should recite the translation by heart. The reader is not permitted to assist the translator, lest people say the translation is written in the Torah scroll. A person of lesser stature may serve as a translator for a person of greater stature. However, it is not befitting the honor of a person of greater stature to serve as translator for a person of lesser stature. Two people should not serve as translators simultaneously. Rather, one person should read and one should translate.
This is quite fascinating because the Yemenite Jews read the translation from a printed book. But what is the purpose of this? That nobody should think the translation is what is written in the Torah scroll. That's the interesting thing. Now, whether in France, whether they had a handwritten translation, I don't know. I don't know whether anything such has survived. But to me, it's fascinating. On the one hand, they want people to understand what is written in the Torah. On the other hand, they don't want people to think the translation's in the Torah. So they kind of have to balance both of those, right? Halakha 12 is a fascinating thing.
But I feel the same way, like when we read with the bar mitzvah and I give the kid the blessing, so I pull the sheet that they used to, and I put it on the Torah, and I'm thinking some people may think that he's reading it from the sheet even though it's reading the Torah, and I kind of...
You should have it on the side.
Right.
Halakha 12 is fascinating. We don't have to read through it, but there are certain passages in the Torah which are a little bit problematic, okay? Mostly involving sexual issues. So the incident involving Reuven, where he has sex with his father's concubines, okay? The priestly benediction, which must always be done in Hebrew. The passage describing the sin of the golden calf, They don't want people to know about it so much. And the description of the innocent concerning Amnon, which of course means they must have done translations of the prophets as well. That's where Amnon rapes his half-sister. So there were certain things in the Torah that were considered unseemly to discuss in public. In fact, in the Mishnah, it also says the sections of the book of Leviticus which describe the laws of incest. They are read, but you don't discuss them. So this is a kind of thing where there's a little bit of censorship involved because they're worried about what people will think. Okay, let's go back to the book. In chapter 13 on page 93, he talks about the triennial. The annual cycle. This is the annual reading of the Torah through completely every year is a Babylonian custom, and that became the common one. Okay? Now, I want to skip to page 94, the law of the mezuzah. And this will be the last thing that we're going to do in terms of blessings. And next week we'll go on to a new topic. You'll notice at the bottom of the page, now if you go back to the full translation, he's got very, very detailed descriptions about how, mezuzah is supposed to be written and what passages. And if you, for example, he's got a whole thing, by the way, on the rules of the Sefer Torah on the parchment and how the different kinds of parchment and what are supposed to be. It's very technical stuff, okay? Interesting, but very technical. But chapter 5 in Mezuzah, he points out that it is the universal custom to write the name of God, which is Shaddai, on the other side of the mezuzah, on the side that doesn't have the writing. And if you look at the parchment of a mezuzah, you will see that on the outside of the parchment, the Shaddai is written. The inside are the passages from the Torah, which is mostly the Shema. And often the Shaddai is often put on the case that holds the mezuzah. By the way, the mezuzah is the parchment, not the case. Okay? But you often see that people will incorporate that Shaddai on the hard case. Okay. He tells you exactly how to do it. He says, as this word is written on the outside, the practice is unobjectionable, meaning he has nothing bad to say about it. They, however, who write the names of angels, holy names, a biblical text, or inscription, usual on seals, he means amulets, by the way, within the mezuzah, are those among whom who have no portion in the world to come. That's pretty strong language here. For these fools not only fail to fulfill the commandment that they treat an important precept that expresses the unity of God, the love of him, and his worship, as if it were an amulet to promote their own personal interests. For according to their foolish minds, the mezuzah is something that will secure them advantage in the vanities of the world. This is part of Maimonides' attack on magic. It was quite common for Jews to consider the mezuzah an amulet of protection. And there are those who believe that to this very day, right? And so evidently there were Jews who were writing magical names of angels and of God inside the mezuzah. And it was very common for Jews to believe that the mezuzah, in effect, was a kind of protective amulet. Maimonides is very anti-magical, as I've said before, where he really attacked this in the laws of idolaters, but also in other parts of the Mishneh Torah. And for him, the mezuzah is pedagogical. It's meant to remind you, to teach you the unity of God, the love of God. Putting a mezuzah on your house, he says, does not protect you. You're trying to seek some kind of personal advantage, and that he considers a grave sin. What's fascinating to me, is that, I want to stop this. Yeah, I'm trying to. All right, no, it's mine. Somebody was phoning me. I hung up. What's fascinating to me, of course, is that when you look up commentaries on this part of the Mishneh Torah, they argue that, in fact, Maimonides is wrong, that having a mezuzah does have protective powers, and they cite various things from various authorities. So there's a tug and pull within the community, and you see in some places in the modern Jewish world where literally, people have claimed that, I remember reading once that because a boy, the mezuzah on his room, the ayin was erased, because the word ayin, the word for the letter ayin means eye, he had an eye problem, and once it was fixed, the eye problem went away. You find some of these outrageous things, like when the Ma'alot massacre occurred many years ago. There was a claim by a local rabbi that because there were the same number of mezuzot were not kosher in the town, this caused the deaths of those 23 children. It was a major scandal. But there are people who still and Maimonides is one of those rationalists who doesn't believe in magic and attacks the magical interpretation of any aspect of Jewish ritual. And this is one of the most common ones, by the way, the notion that the mezuzah somehow is a kind of protective amulet. We actually know from the literature of the church fathers, there were Christians who asked rabbis to put mezuzahs on their house, thinking it was a protective amulet, and the church fathers were really angry about this and were attacking Christians who had mezuzahs on their houses. Yeah. This is from the 2nd century, by the way.
We have Colombian friends who come up here a lot.
Yeah.
And when peasants look for jobs in Bogota,
yes,
they'll only look for houses with mezuzahs, because usually they educate those people.
Yes.
And they'll pay them more.
Well, I've heard of circumstances when a buyer buys a house and who is not Jewish, and because the mezuzahs are attached to the house, do not want the previous owner to remove them.
Oh, yes.
Even
So,
if they're not Jewish.
because they feel it has some kind of protective power.
Jewish, you're not supposed to remove the
No,
mezuzah,
if it's a Jewish buyer, you are not supposed to remove it. You can replace them with the cases, with less expensive cases, but the parchments have to remain.
The parchment has to remain.
Exactly, but not the case. Okay.
I had a question
Yes.
for an Orthodox man who was on our boat.
Yes.
And I said to him, should we have a mezuzah at the entranceway, at the companionway to going downstairs? And he thought for a few moments, and he said, no, because it's not a permanent dwelling.
Right. Exactly. It has to be on a permanent dwelling, like you don't need a mezuzah on a sukkah. And it's got to be a door that's got a lintel. The only place in the house where you don't put a mezuzah technically is a bathroom.
But the mezuzah in a synagogue is just a matter of custom. It's
Yes,
not required.
synagogues, because they're not houses, are not required to have mezuzahs, but I have never seen a synagogue without a mezuzah. All right, we'll see you next week.